faculty in African American Studies and Women's and Gender Studies at Syracuse University. He earned his PhD in philosophy from Rutgers University. His research lies principally in philosophy of language, philosophy of humor, and philosophy of race. He is co-editor of the Routledge Companion to the Philosophy of Race, and he is currently working on a book entitled The Ethics of Racial Humor, forthcoming with Oxford University Press, and a co-edited volume, The Oxford Handbook of Applied Philosophy of Language, also with Oxford University Press. Our second speaker, Dr. Janine Jones, is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She earned her PhD in philosophy from UCLA. She is co-editor of Pursuing Trayvon Martin, Historical Context and Contemporary Manifestations of Racial Dynamics, author of Disappearing Black People Through Failures of White Empathy in Feminist Philosophy of Mind, and more recently of When Black Female Presence in Beauvoir's L'Invité is Seemingly Not Invited to the Second Sex in Simone de Beauvoir Journal Studies. She is interested in problems that lie at the intersection of imagination, language, and perception, and is as especially applied in the race-gendered realisms in which we live. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Dr. Luvell Anderson.
Thank you for that kind invitation, introduction, and thanks you all for inviting me to be a part of this. Thought that what I'll do with you today is so sketch out some ideas on a chapter that I'm working on for that book on the ethics of racial humor. It's entitled Laughing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Comedic Imagination. So Dave Chappelle told Oprah Winfrey back in 2006 that he felt uncomfortable with some laughter from a crew member doing a skit he did in blackface. Chappelle recounts the event. There was a good-spirited intention behind it. So then when I'm on the set and we're finally taping the sketch, somebody on the set who was white laughed in such a way. I know the difference of people laughing with me and people laughing at me. And it was the first time I had ever gotten a laugh that I was uncomfortable with. Not just uncomfortable, but like, should I fire this person? After the incident, Dave began thinking about the message he was sending to millions of viewers. Dave says some people understood exactly what he was trying to say with his racially charged comedy, while others got the wrong idea. That concerned me, he says. I don't want Black people to be disappointed in me for putting that out there. It's a complete moral dilemma. What is the nature of the dilemma about which Chappelle was concerned? What seems most immediate, given his statement, is the apparent mismatch between what he aims to communicate with his humor and how non-Black audiences in general, and white audiences in particular, interpret that humor. In effect, the question Chappelle brings to the fore is this: how can we tell when someone is laughing with rather than laughing at you? And because race is the salient factor, we can ask how one can tell when racial others are laughing with or laughing at a performer or performance. A scene near the end of Paul Beatty's masterful The Sellout depicts this dilemma in stark fashion. This traffic court jester did more than tell jokes. He plucked out your subconscious and beat you silly with it, not until you were unrecognizable, but until you were recognizable. One night, a white couple strolled into the club 2 hours after doors opened, sat front and center, and joined in the frivolity. Sometimes they laughed loudly. Sometimes they snickered knowingly, like they'd been Black all their lives. I don't know what caught his attention, his perfectly spherical head drenched in house-like sweat. Maybe their laughter was a pitch too high, heeing when they should have been hawing. Maybe they were too close to the stage. Maybe if white people didn't feel the need to sit up front all the damn time, it never would have happened. What the fuck are you laughing at? He shouted. More chuckling from the audience. The white couple howling the loudest, slapping the table, happy to be noticed, happy to be accepted. I ain't bullshitting. What the fuck are you interloping motherfuckers laughing at? Get the fuck out. There's nothing funny about nervous laughter. The forced way it slogs through a room with the stop and start undulations of bad jazz brunch jazz. The Black folks in the round table of Latinas out for a night on the town knew when to stop laughing. The couple didn't. The rest of us silently sipped our canned beer and sodas, determined to stay out of the fray. They were laughing solo because this had to be a part of the show, right? Do I look like I'm fucking joking with you? This shit ain't for you, understand? Like, get the fuck out. This is our thing. There may be multiple ways to interpret this scene. One such way expresses a concern about whether the white couple could be in on the kind of humor being presented. That is, are they capable of laughing with the jokes? In the time remaining, I will sketch out briefly some thoughts about this distinction between laughing at and laughing with. Some ideas about what an audience brings to a performance and how that background impacts interpretation. And lastly, how whiteness might play a role in altering the object of humor in a way that makes laughing with the humor of racialized others a complex and difficult task. Essentially, I want to ask the following question from the perspective of the audience member. How can I know whether I'm laughing with or laughing at humor directed at groups I'm not a member of? There God, in Just Joking, distinguishes between laughter and amusement. Laughter can express a range of things: amusement, anxiety, derision, embarrassment, or nothing at all. It can be inappropriate to laugh at something even if it is fitting to be amused by it. It seems clear that we are focusing on something broader than amusement here. Okay, let's take a moment to work our way through the distinction between laughing at and laughing with. Robert Mankoff, in a New Yorker short piece, describes the dichotomy as one between sympathy and antipathy. Laughing with connotes the sense of solidarity and fellow feeling. To laugh with someone, we might say, involves sharing something crucial in common with them, to see oneself as and be seen as in community with that person. To be in community generally involves a sense of shared goals, desires, values, and in some sense, identity. The function of laughter in these instances is to proffer a fondness that exhibits the kind of fellow feeling that often accompanies communal recognition. What more can we say about this notion? I think there are at least two parts to sort out: what we might refer to as a reflective part and an expressive part. Let's take the reflective part first. What I am thinking about here essentially concerns a question about whether one need actively recognize one is laughing out of a sense of shared community in order to laugh with, and what such recognition might be. It certainly seems like one could falsely believe one is laughing out of a sense of shared community, for instance. If this is true, then what would establish genuine recognition from perhaps false consciousness? Let's suppose that one must, in some sense to be described, recognize this shared sense. We might think this includes having a particular kind of attitude towards the object of humor, a positive one of some sort. Further, it also might include a kind of intimacy between performer and audience. Perhaps a feeling of intimacy provides the ground that makes laughing with possible. However this shakes out, the idea is that these things have to be a consciously reflective part of the audience member's engagement with the performance. The expressive part concerns what the laughter itself communicates, or perhaps indicates. Again, as a first pass, we might start with the idea that laughing with someone expresses a particular positive attitude towards the object, a pro attitude of some sort. Now, a question to be resolved is whether expressing a pro attitude in this context entails having a pro attitude towards the object. Just in terms of common sense, it seems the two notions can and do come apart. For instance, I can express sympathy towards your plight without actually having empathy for you. I can express it in the sense of display as a way of being polite. That is, the sympathy displayed may in fact be a pretense. This kind of pretense, however, would appear to be inconsistent with the kind of fellow feeling associated with laughing with. Presumably, the expression must be sincere, or at least so one might claim. Thus, to actually laugh with someone, one must recognize one is laughing out of a shared sense of community and sincerely express a pro attitude towards the object of humor. Now let's consider the other side of the distinction. To enter a brief caveat, laughing at does not always signal something ethically troubling. For instance, the kind of laughter well-designed satire provokes is arguably a species of laughing at. Thus, my uses of laughing at from here on out refers only to those ethically troubling instances. Laughing at is typically associated with derision. One laughs at a target one is disposed to feel negatively towards, or at least feel socially distant from. The latter part of that, laughing out of a sense of social distance, weakens the claim in a seemingly appropriate way. That is because it doesn't seem necessary to think one must hold a derisive attitude towards someone to laugh at them, that it may be enough to simply regard them as an other, someone different from you in some significant way. A possible example of laughing at is perhaps provoked by a bit from late night talk show host and former Saturday Night Live cast member, Seth Meyers. During the infamous White House Correspondents' Dinner, where Obama roasted Trump, Meyers also had a go at him. On one occasion, Meyers remarked, "Trump has been saying he will run for president as a Republican, which is surprising, since I just assumed he was running as a joke." What would make amusement in this case an instance of laughing at? Well, if I go out on a limb and say that you all do not find Trump a sympathetic figure, and that you don't really consider yourself members of the same community in the relevant sense, or identify with him in any meaningful way, then your laughter signals more of a reveling in the sting of Meyers' joke than a bonding of some sort. Is there also a reflective and expressive component with laughing at? Well, given the considerations we just entertained, there appears to be an expressive component for sure. That is, laughter expresses a lack of fellow feeling or feeling of solidarity, due either to an attitude of derision or a sense of social distance from the target. In fact, derisive laughter is the kind of thing 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes believed characterized humor. For Hobbes, people delight in the shortcoming of others because he believes they are naturally individualistic and competitive. Hobbes writes, "Sudden glory is the passion which makes those grimaces called laughter, and is caused either by some sudden act of their own that pleases them, or by the apprehension of some deformed thing in another, by comparison whereof they suddenly applaud themselves." Here we see for Hobbes that laughter is the result of the laugher glorying in their superiority over the inferior object of their amusement. I'm skeptical there is a reflexive condition, however, since it seems reasonable to think one can laugh at someone or something unreflectively. How can one fail to recognize they have a derisive attitude towards something or fail to realize a sense of social distance? It seems to me you could genuinely believe you are expressing a pro attitude towards something while actually othering and hence socially distancing yourself from it. The identification of a distinctive form of Black humor is suggestive of a distinction in comedic enterprise by which I mean a set of practices designed to elicit mirth from a particular audience. The distinctiveness gives rise to the thought that there are particular rules and interpretations one must attend to in order to fully or truly appreciate works in that particular genre. Part of the reason has to do with the conditionality of humor. Finding some comedic bit funny requires sharing background knowledge in common, knowledge appealed to in the telling of a joke. Not knowing the relevant background beforehand bars the recipient from mirthful enjoyment, since it is an antecedent requirement to mirth. So when the MC tells the white couple in the Dum Dum Donut Shop that this Black comedy is our thing, it provokes a few thoughts. A more general one that emerges concerns what it is audience members bring to a performance and how it interacts with it to produce an interpretation. In her Massey lectures turned book, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness, and the Literary Imagination, Toni Morrison wonders about the effects of being positioned as white on interpretation. She writes, I'm interested to know what that assumption has meant to the literary imagination. When does racial unconsciousness or awareness of race enrich interpretive language, and when does it impoverish it? Morrison points out the implausibility of a set of assumptions circulated among literary historians and critics as knowledge, namely, that traditional canonical American literature is free of, uninformed, and unshaped by the 400-year-old presence of first Africans and then African Americans in the United States. She wonders to what extent the championed characteristics of our national literature are actually responses to a dark, abiding, signing Africanist presence. The thought is that the pervading sense of Americanness the national literature is claimed to emanate from derives its character and shape from this Africanist presence. This wonder sets Morrison off on a study of what she refers to as American Africanism, which she uses as a term for the denotative and connotative Blackness that African peoples have come to signify, as well as the entire range of views, assumptions, readings, and misreadings that accompany Eurocentric learning about these people. Morrison is concerned about the effects this Africanism has on the literary imagination of non-Black writers. What I would like to do is see what insights we can glean from Morrison to think of the ways this Africanist presence might also impact white comedic imagination in encounters with Black humor. For present purposes, I will think of the imagination as a process for conceiving of sets of possibilities, for making sense of various things, and the comedic imagination as a process that incorporates certain impossibilities among those sets. Steve Garner provides a relational and comparative argument for whiteness as a conceptual tool in his book, Whiteness, an Introduction. The notion of whiteness Garner presents takes on the sense of a social scientific tool meant to explain both cognitive and affective implications of people racialized as white. What is useful here is that whiteness, in Garner's sense, is a means for thinking about the ways various white peoples are socialized into the world and the way those socializations impact interpretive encounters with those things that enter their environment. Long story short, our engagements with things like humor, I want to suggest, are mediated by imaginations that are cultivated in historically specific ways. Some ways, here whiteness in particular, provide distinctive interpretive challenges. This has all been very exploratory. My goal has been to raise some critical considerations and think through some of the implications. For the sake of time, I'm going to stop here and then engage you all in Q&A to further meet out the details. So thank you.
And now we will hear from Dr. Janine Jones.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barnes, for the invitation. Thank you for the very polite introduction. I'm going to jump right in. And actually, Professor Barnes, could you give me like a signal when I've got 5 minutes left to go? As I told you, I'm going to take, yeah. Can Can some, yeah, you can do it, or someone can do it? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so actually this talk has a different title than the one that Dr. Barnes and I talked about like maybe 2-3 times. This is now called Art's Encounter with White People in General, with Black people in particular. Okay. In philosophy erased, philosophy erased, Charles Mills maintains, quote, "It is not part of the definition of literature that it be restricted either formally or de facto to whites. What makes philosophy distinctive is that not merely have there been racist views in the tradition of the intellectual capacities of people of color, but that the conception of the discipline itself is inimical to the recognition. Philosophy is supposed to be abstracting away from the contingent, the corporeal, the temporal, the material to get at necessary spiritual, eternal, ideal truths. Because race as a topic is manifestly not one of those eternal truths, it is necessarily handicapped from the start," end of quote. I think Mills is right about philosophy, but where Black people and Blackness are concerned, literature, the arts, and other cultural engagements, such as sport, where artistry can be nurtured and on full display, are also handicapped from the start. Let me just say this, I believe that Mills repudiated a little bit that view. I believe it because I believe I read it. I don't remember where I read it, but I'm almost certain that I did, that he took that back, making philosophy distinctive in that particular point. So in any case, this paper is not about Mills. It's not about Mills held that view, let me argue against Mills. It is about a certain way of understanding that this thing that happens in philosophy, where philosophy of race gets associated with the contingent, with the material, with the corporeal. This is in all the different disciplines, fields, areas out there in the world. And so I find that very interesting because one often worries, or one is often asked about, how is this systemic? Well, you start linking up these different structures of systems where there are just those kinds of moves, you'll start to see system in a certain way if you're having a hard time seeing it. Anyway, ideas about Black corporeality, materiality may be elaborated through different schemes within a field and across fields. One mode within literature with a capital L looks something like the following, where the contingent, the corporeal, the temporal, the material may not appear as such, but rather in the guise of particularity, which within certain conceptual constellations are intricately linked to the aforementioned. So this next section is called White People in General, Black People in Particular. First, let's talk briefly about literature with a capital L. Okay, white people, where this includes white authors, white characters, the white worlds they write about, all of which may be highlighted and displayed through the juxtaposed presentation of Black stereotypes, engage thought and feeling about universality. This is not because white particularity is not represented or depicted in characters, it is. The individuality, the particularity, the complexity of the particularity of white characters in literature and in film is arguably celebrated. But particularity in white people, including their modes of thought and elaborations within and outside of literature, appear, they take place in worlds in which white people are normed as people in general, as human beings in general. Their thought and elaborations as that of real people, of real human beings in general. And that assumed, often unspoken in general, enforced by various interlocking systems of norming, which create a field of the normative, as opposed to this little domain of a particular normativity over here, for example, in that Black neighborhood, or that little domain of a particular normativity over there in some broader Black community. Realize both the affect and the appearance of an effective universality. The affect and the appearance of an effective universality, i.e. a universality that counts. In other words, that matters effectively, can result in the kind of interrogation of Black artists, example, writers, witnessed in the interviews of Percival Everett, author of God's Country, Erasure, I'm Not Sidney Poitier, a novel, and The History of the American People by Strom Thurmond, amongst many others, by Caroline Boudet and Hervé Gardet for France Culture's Grande Table, and Toni Morrison by Charlie Rose. A lot is going on in these interviews, and so my focus here is extremely narrow. Moreover, I do not report the Morrison interview in full. Let's begin with the French interview, which is remarkable given that in the French context, where due to a post-war renunciation of collaboration with Adolf Hitler's genocidal project, the French state refuses to use race as an identifying category, is a cornerstone of French national identity, as observed by Kaima L. Glover in her introduction to Francois Vergès's The Wombs of Women, Race, Capital, Feminism. In fact, that might be a direct quote from her, or practically. Arguably, it is not only the state that operates the refusal, but French citizens themselves. What percentage, what demographic groups? Either this has been determined or is to be determined or can be determined. I believe that this is so through lived experience with university-educated white French people who subscribe to the idea that if biology says that race doesn't exist, then it doesn't, and that it is quasi-criminal to speak of it as though it does. All the Black and people of Maghreb origin in France that I've spoken with, they talk to me about race as though they believe it exists. Of course, this is all anecdotal. I don't underplay the, I would need to work on the importance of anecdote before I would try to make a statement about it. But I think it is never to be just underplayed. Thus, it was no surprise to me, France's official position on race notwithstanding, that Broudet and Gaudet questioned Everett quite pointedly about his status as a Black American writer. Interviewer. Now, this is pretty much the interview in full. It's translated though, so this is not their actual words. This is my translation of their words. It is not the first time in your literature that you bring up the condition of Black people identity and the question of race. Nonetheless, you don't allow yourself to cast your literature as Black American literature. You are someone like your compatriots, Colson Whitehead and Eddie Harris, who say that they write like all writers. They advocate a literature that is without color. But isn't this a paradox to say when you are writing as a Black writer about the Black condition and almost only about this subject? Everett. Well, that's not all I do. I write about figures in classical Greek mythology, Hispanic characters, and characters that could be called white. But of what importance is the race of the characters really? When a white American writes about white characters, you don't call that white literature. It's the nomenclature that poses a problem, the terminology. We shouldn't use labels. There is a tendency to use artificial labels, and this could be harmful. It's not because the person writing is a Black American that he has an aesthetic that will differ from that of artistic practice in general. Interviewer. So it is in this sense that you refuse the label Black American writer. You were not destined from birth to write Black American literature. But the subjects you bring up, Percival Everett, are subjects that touch upon the question of race, Everett. That's because it exists in the world. If a white American person writes a novel about the white middle class, then it is about white people in America, isn't it? But what is said about this literature does not get reduced to what one would say about the condition of white Americans. Labels reduce work. They reduce the work of the writer to a role that is minor. It's not because the person writing is a Black American that he writes a Black American story. I don't know what that means. It's just a type of artificial identification. Interviewer. Do you have the impression that these labels are used more in the US or more in Europe or on a planetary scale? Do you find that you always must provide this type of explanation, Everett? Yes, I think it generally is true. This is a fetishization of race amongst liberals, but race is also a question for conservatives. Perspectives from which they attack the question may be different, but the subject of race remains the same. Interviewer. Do you think that when someone is white, he thinks less about why he is white? Everett. White people are always shocked to find out that Black people are not walking around thinking about being Black, and that people of color do not define themselves by their contrast with white people. That's the end of what I'm reporting of that interview. Arguably, Everett captures something in the idea of particularity through the language of minor role. Further, arguably, the use of labels of which he speaks as systemic and normative within the normative field in which literature shows up in outside of the literature world. The label Black reduces a certain kind of particularity to itself, that which is not labeled, not fixed, affixed to itself, which is not itself to begin with, but that's a subject for another day. And when that something is white and not labeled, it can travel in affect and thought beyond itself to the in general. Moreover, even when whiteness is labeled as white and classed, like les gilets jaunes, it can so travel to the in general, people in general. This suggests that the problem of labeling is relational. The relation between what is labeled and the way the labels and other discourses work within the overarching dominant operative normative space impact reducibility and facilitate white deflection. Notice how the interviewer makes the problem about race and Blackness Percival's problem. Interviewer: it is not the first time in your literature that you bring up the condition of Black people identity and the question of race. Nonetheless, you don't allow yourself to cast your literature as Black, American literature. Does the interviewer respond to Percival's query, which was, if a white American person writes a novel about the white middle class, then it's about white people in America, isn't it? No, the interviewer eventually returns with, but the subjects that you bring up, Percival Everett, are subjects that touch upon the question of race. In other words, you're the one that puts race out there, now you own it. You might note that I didn't introduce this section as some observations on French white deflection. The white American man, Charlie Rose, in his interview with Toni Morrison, uses, I don't know if there's similar forms of deflection, but there are definitely forms of deflection. Charlie Rose, speaking to Toni Morrison. Bill Moyers, I think, once asked you the question, can you imagine writing a novel that's not centered about race? And you said, absolutely. Toni Morrison, yes. Charlie Rose, will you? Toni Morrison, that's what he asked. They laugh. The two laugh quite a lot throughout this interview. Toni Morrison, I think, you see, I answered the question he didn't pose. You know, Tolstoy writes about race, Charlie Rose, yeah. Toni Morrison, all the time. So does Zola. So does James Joyce. Now, if anyone can go up to an imaginary James Joyce and say, quote, you write about race all the time. It's central in your novels. When are you going to write about what? You see, because the person who asked that question doesn't understand that he or she is also raced. Yes, I can write about white people. White people can write about Black people. Anything can happen in art. There are no boundaries there. Having to do it or having to prove that I can do it is what was embarrassing or insulting. In this book I did, she's referring to Paradise. Charlie Rose, it was insulting that people, help me understand. What was insulting? The idea that you felt like you could. Toni Morrison, yeah. The question was posed as though it were a desirable thing to do, to write about white people or to write not about race. That's what that means to me, and that it was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important, and that I was still writing about marginal people. And why don't I come into the mainstream, Charlie Rose? Aren't you importing a little too much into the question? Toni Morrison, maybe, laughter. Charlie Rose, I think so. Toni Morrison, but what else could it be, Charlie? What does that mean? What does that question mean? You tell me if I'm making too much of it. Then there's more, where actually Toni Morrison elaborates at length about how she learned how to write without having the white gaze in her work through African writers like Achebe, who were not putting the white gaze in their work because they're not coming from worlds where all of their experience is determined by what a white gaze thinks. And she talked about how reading books from a certain period and coming out of the United States from Black writers, she could always tell that the writer was writing to a white gaze and to a white audience. And she said, because the kind of things they were explaining, they wouldn't have had to explain it to me. They must have been explaining it to white people. Charlie Rose, I think this is one of those times where what you just said gave you an ennobled answer, regardless of the significance of the question. Laughter. Yes, indeed. Charlie Rose, who does not even understand what he's asking Toni Morrison, is nevertheless positioned to evaluate Morrison's response as to its significance while in his ignorance, concluding that she is making much ado about nothing. When Morrison says, quote, and that was a difficult thing to do, a higher level of artistic endeavor, or it was more important that I was still writing about marginal people, and why don't I come to the mainstream? To my mind, she could have continued. Why don't I come into the mainstream and write about real people, the people who matter, the people who count? Isn't that what you're saying? Am I an artist who can pull that off, who can reach beyond the particular, which is much easier to write about, mired as it is in that which I can just read off my lived experience? No imagination or artistic skill required. Or do I have a mind the kind of mind that can transcend irreducible particularity and write about the general human condition. Given the interlocking ways in which the projects of whiteness have normed the world, the human condition in general is understood to be about white people. In fact, and this is not the kind of claim that says Black people aren't human beings. It's just that the human beings in general, the human condition in general, that's about white people. In fact, I don't believe that Morrison's appeal to, quote, our white writers asked whether they can write about Black people is quite right. It's a red herring. The appeal sets up the problem between white and Black writers as though it were symmetrical. There is a structural asymmetry at play here, which does not derive from the characters, Black or white themselves, but rather from the fact that Black writers are Black people in particular, and white writers are white people in general. White people do not have to write about Black people to prove that they can transcend their particular worlds. As representatives of the human condition in general, they transcend their particular condition a fortiori. Their very structural position understands them as having the capacity to speak and write, beyond their particularity, even beyond the ignorance that would seem to present some of them doing so. Inhabiting this structural position, this capacity is conferred upon them. It breathes through their being, showing up in the things they say and do, the things they do not say and do, in the ways they do not stand to be corrected by anyone from the realm of the particular, in particular. It is something like their right to write beyond their particularity, which they can exercise or not. Nothing turns on it, but a lot does turn on Morrison's having to write about white people. Sometimes the converging constructions and improvised proliferating conceits, unwitting or not, of realities that reduce Black people to particularity take an explicit form as they return Black people to their bodies. The example of the kind of construction I have in mind now, which I'm going to set forward, is perhaps less abstract than the procedure that emanates from the various ways that affect realities in which white people, who are people in general, and Black people who are people in particular, artists included. The constructed example I want to introduce here, which comes from the world of sport, goes into the making of the abstraction. Here I will assume, without argumentation in this presentation as a whole, that means I'm not going to argue the point here, that many sports superficially and deeply engage forms of art and artistry. So the next section, actually, again, I'm actually going to be, there's an article that's called The Fall of French Football Team, Soccer, that's what they mean by football, soccer, football team, multiculturalism, biopolitics, and post-colonialism by a sociologist named Éric Maigret, who was writing this article, I think, in response to what happened when at the World Cup, the French not only did not make the 8th finals, there was a huge thing where that coach, Dominic, he threw Anelka out and the team refused to train and the whole thing was on display. And so it was a huge disaggregation. It wasn't just a loss of the game. So here I am simply setting forth points made by Maigret. Maigret made the following points in the context of the gradual disaggregation of the French national soccer team in the 1990s, reaching a climax with the 2010 soccer disaster when the French national team failed at the 8th finals of the World Cup and displayed their lack of unity during the famous mutiny of Kinsa, where the players refused to train after the head, Raymond Domenech, got rid of Nicolas Anelka. Maigret seeks to provide an analysis of this disaggregation. He believes that an explanation must be twofold. There's an organizational analysis that must be given, a biopolitical analysis in order. I'm only focusing on the second. So here's some of the background, and this is coming from him. I'm paraphrasing. And again, I'm translating, so it's not just paraphrasing. What was gestating for years, the rejection of a team because of its competitive failures, but also because of the ethno-racial origin and behavior of some of its players, suddenly blossomed and overwhelmed by a wave of racism debates in the public sphere. That is when that thing happened. So then it just blew up. This racism, although cultural and not biological, this is him, Maigret asserts, attributed to the original culture or religion of the players, the problems encountered. The biopolitical factor implicated in the failure of French soccer is older and a more surprising, according to Maigret's perspective, than the organizational factor. He states, a real neo-colonial racial policy was consciously developed over the past 30 years in France, our country, in response to the physical and techno-tactical challenges imposed by other nations. The policy led to an impasse, he explains. Discursively, the French player was conceived as having panache and bravado, as being innovative, but he was considered as having insufficient physical impact or consistency on the pitch, or in cunning. Too pure and chivalrous, he lost out to the Germans, who were thought to be more direct. He also lost out to, the French player, also lost out to the Italians, who were criticized for their deceit and who compensated for their physical inferiority by the utilization of an ultra-defensive technique that's called, in Italian, le catenaccio. I don't know, all I know is that it's thought to be a very aggressive mode of playing, very aggressive defensive mode of playing. Maigret tells us that the rise of Black players in French clubs in the national selection during the 1990s and 2000 corresponds to the ethno-racial upheavals in French society, but also to the search for physical impact on the pitch, which French soccer, decade after decade then, it would reduce itself to. It would reduce itself to this strategy of having force on the pitch. The selection and training of apprentice soccer players in training centers, the purchase, he puts that word in scare quotes, of foreign players through well-controlled African channels was implemented more and more with an eye to satisfying athletic criteria. And this was done, in Maigret's estimation, to the detriment of technical and tactical dimensions of the beautiful game. Thus, a kind of division of labor was established between Black players and white players, with Black players often assigned defensive tasks and white players playing as midfielders and attackers. This is my note. The midfield are thought to be the creators on the field. And of course, your attacker is the one who scores, who takes initiative and scores. Yes, I'll leave it at that for the moment. The division of labor strategy yielded some early success. Winners at the Champions League of 1993 against AC Milan, French's Marseille soccer club boasted of possessing a Black guard, according to the expression of Breonna Taylor, a French businessman and politician. An innovative Black line composed almost entirely of very powerful Black players, Marcel Desailly, Jocelyn Angoulême, and Basile Boli, who were then exported to the national team, where the team's success in 1998 is now history. It is true they were playing with Zinedine Zidane in the midfield, but hardly a goal was conceded thanks to the iron defense that brought together the athletic talents of Desailly and Thurman from Monaco, Black men from Monaco, two must players, as the sports commentators were fond of saying. Maigret writes that the success of the Black Guard was not only a welcome and meritocratic opening to diversity, the discourse of the leaders at the club level of the national team and of journalists made an appeal to the Senegalese tirailleurs who supplemented, that's his word, the French National Army, who were considered, his word again, primary material in the battle against the great others, Germans and Italians. What do we have thus far? This is
Janine, just really quick, 5-minute mark.
Okay, let me see here. I got it. Let me see if I can get through this. Okay, division of labor. Where Blacks are the defensive line and where their bodies are used and perceived as weapons, not of mass creation or destruction often a form of creation, but of weapons of mass prevention. A formation of Black bodies can impede order advanced by an opposing side. Whites and some browns are the midfields. And in Zidane, where creation can happen, creation, by the way, is not seen in the body, though bodies need not be subtracted for its appreciation. Creation shows up for vision in the beholding of plays and the play. Let's see. I'm trying to figure out where I should stop. Okay. The ready-made reality created is one that the public at large can read like a map. A new map of the pitch where basic divisions include creators whose art, mastery, and panache create goals. Black guards whose bodily force is perceived as essential. Yes, they're essential workers. A public that denies race describes this empirical fact, ready-made for theorization about the force of Black bodies versus the wondrous capacity of white and a few brown players for collective mind play, ready-made to realize a certain effect with respect to Black bodies and white minds, an illusory effect that poses as offering a possession as a perception as necessary as that of the Miller-Lyer illusion. And in cascading fashion, the necessary illusion creating affect around Black bodies and white minds, and affect around understandings of their necessary opposition. Here are the facts, the data is the numbers. I can hear the proclaimed with great passion, because this is something that you can actually put data to. Number of Black bodies out there on the field, how many games these people win and play, and you can look at the empirical facts. And the facts will, by extension, into other necessary illusory realms endemic to the social field, be reinforced not just through repetition of the kind of territorial maps carved out, but by the cumulative effect they create and the fact that such territories join up apparently naturally. All of this can be perceived and expressed with the denial of structural or systemic racism against Black people. Let me see what I want to leave out here. I'm going to leave out this. I'm sorry to leave it out, but anyway, let me end on the last page because I wanted to bring Dr. Tori back in. Let me see if I can, how can I do this? Towards the end, I'm talking about what happens at the end, what the French do at a certain point. This is the point. Towards the end, what the French do, when I say they reduce this strategy, they start using white bodies in the same way. Or I should say white people, but really it's a reduction to their bodies. That is to say that, so what I started out saying there was, as certain kinds of white people have seen, they can be blackened too. They don't become Black, but they can be blackened. This started happening to the white players. And so in effect, they were just teaching everybody how to muscle up and use force, not teaching artistry anymore, not teaching skills that are compatible with that, not teaching tactics, and they ended in failure. So then what I'm saying in the piece is that, well, how could this be resolved? Well, you could reinstall a division of labor, okay? And I also want to say that when they took that strategy, well, then Blacks could play in the midfield too. So then you began to see Blacks in the midfield, since the strategy anyway is just all about muscle and body. So the question is, well, if you wanted to fix this, if you wanted to remedy this, are you going to do it now where you don't do the division of labor from before, or you do the thing that you did before, which is a kind of replication of enslavement, colonization? It would be right along the path that France knows. And so at the end, I was asking a question like, when you do this kind of thing, when Black people are, because my problem is with what Black people do. That's who I want to center. When Black people are involved in these kind of processes, is it for them, even if they're part of the team? Can they celebrate, even if they're part of the team? So I want to end with Dr. Tori. Dr. Tori mentioned Andrew Johnson, a wrestler on the Breonna team. He was a wrestler in South Jersey. Johnson was given an ultimatum: cut his dreadlocks or forfeit the game. I too cannot get that picture out of my mind. White people might be obsessed with what happened with the officer's knee. And I'm losing his name even in the neck, okay? This is a picture I can't get out of my mind. Johnson, so they give him the ultimatum. He can either play or he can forfeit the game. He had his dreadlock cut. He won in overtime, which sparked his team Buena in victory. But what kind of victory was this for him, for Black people, anywhere? What kind of map might be made of and from these pictures. Might it be said, as though it were some kind of consolation, well, he did it for the team in general won. That's what matters, that's what counts. And I do just want to share my picture at the end, my screen at the end, because I think these pictures are important. It's not, of course, the ref cutting his hair. It's a white girl cutting his hair. And over here, we see these people here, people of color, brown, black boys sitting down. White girl cutting his hair off, a white boy doing whatever, encouraging him, and another white man sitting here. And do any of them care about him? Does he matter at all? Does he count at all? So I'm going to end there, and I'll just end.
Thank you very much for that. Please join me in thanking both of our speakers with your little claps if you'd like. Since on Zoom we can't really clap. And we will open it up for questions.
So I have a question for Luvell. You know, you talk about laughing with as, what is it? You know, you described it in a couple different ways, a sense of solidarity and fellow feeling, being in community with, communal recognition, those as components of laughing with. And I'm curious about, particularly when we're thinking about, I don't know if you call it race humor or what, but this notion of white people's comfortability in so-called Black spaces, right? The vignette that you offer is kind of pushing back against this. Where does that fit in the first place, right? There's a sense in which you don't share solidarity and fellow feeling. Maybe you imagine yourself to, or maybe you're inserting yourself into spaces as someone, as like the white observers in this, in the vignette you described. And I'm just trying to figure out where the place is, if there really is a kind of space for laughing with in a really deep sense. And what I have in mind is like the vignette you offer, but also I think about like Black Twitter, right? Everybody gets on Twitter, and you know, that things kind of take a turn when folks who are not part of the community in which certain jokes and moments happen insert themselves into the space. And I don't want to say white people can't ever laugh with, but I'm just trying to figure out where the boundary is there.
Yeah, that's a good question, to which I don't really have a great answer other than I think it's right to be skeptical about most instances of insertion. Most of these are usually just usurpations or trespassings of some sort. It's kind of taking liberties. So maybe one thing to say, right, is that perhaps one way of defining a certain kind of soft border has to do with what we might think of moments of invitation, right, where the spaces, particular spaces, are opened up for kind of cross-communal, cross-cultural sharing and mirth or something like that, right? And in those moments, it seems like, you know, laughing with is a possibility, right? And then we might think of a different space where those are spaces constructed specifically for members of a particular community, maybe a certain kind of Black community, to do a certain sort of thing in that space. And that people who aren't parts of those communities, who sort of enter into those spaces uninvited, sort of intrusive or whatever, just the possibility of laughing with is off the table because of the kind of social act that's being performed, right, in the space itself. So that's something about the construction of the space blocks or excludes sort of the possibility of laughing with in those particular moments because the space is set up in a particular sort of way. But then there's a sort of ambiguity, right? Where you're not quite sure what the space is supposed to be. And it doesn't get worked out until we're off and running. And then people sort of insert themselves into them. And only then when you get feedback from what you might think of as the core participants of that community, then you figure out, oh, this isn't actually a space where laughing with across sort of communal cultural lines or whatever is possible. So I think there are some clear cases where yes, no, and then an ambiguous sort of space where it just sort of gets worked out in real time. And I don't know what to say really about, you know, antecedently defining those borders for those ambiguous cases.
In the meantime, I also had a question for Dr. Anderson. I was curious to hear more about laughing as an utterance. As you were talking, I was thinking about that. So yesterday in Dr. Basu's talk, she talked a little bit about the difference between belief versus saying what you believe. And it seems like with laughter, there is more of a role of an affect there, maybe unconscious, emotional state somebody has to be in. And sometimes we fake laugh and so on. So I was curious to hear you say more about that.
Yeah. So what about the utterance in particular? Are you thinking of what the laughter can communicate in a particular way or what?
Yeah, do you think there's something special about laughter as revealing of an affective state? And is the wrong of laughing the wrong of having that affective state or expressing it? Like, is there an obligation to suppress laughter or maybe even fake laughter sometimes?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so I think what laughter expresses is hard to pin down sometimes because we can do so many things. We can express so many things when we laugh, right? So laughter doesn't always express amusement at something, right? So sometimes laughter really is sort of one laughs in a particular situation because you're trying to communicate that you are, I don't know, friendly and not hostile or something, right? So yeah, so I mean, so that the Chappelle example that I started off with was a clear instance where he thought he could tell what was being communicated by the laughing of the white crew member or whatever, right? That the sound of the laughter signaled a certain kind of derision or some kind of untoward pleasure that this person was having, right? And I think there are some empirical studies that should give evidence for this, that certain ways in which laughter sounds at certain points can communicate that kind of thing, can communicate that there's a kind of derision or something like that happening. I don't know about sort of guiding principles in general to like mete out, you know, what's being communicated or what's being expressed by a laughing event or whatever. I suspect that some of that's just going to be done by appeal to the contextual features in a particular moment. Some of it will be appealing to certain kinds of sociological, biographical background notes that you might have about the person themselves, right? But yeah, I think it's going to be kind of variable. So difficult to pin down just in general. It'll be sort of a case by case, person by person sort of thing.
I wanted to ask you whether someone in the position of David Chappelle, a comedian, let's suppose that they distinguish between laughing with and some kind of antipathy going on with laughter. Can they invoke that if, in principle, does it make sense that they invoke that when they themselves as a comedian tell jokes where they are laughing and their audience is laughing, and he, for example, may arguably is not laughing with a particular group. And I'm thinking of his jokes, some of his jokes against transgender people. And notice I even say the word against. Now, I'm not saying every transgender person will see it that way, but I believe that I've read that some transgender people were offended by his jokes. Listening to them, they certainly didn't sound to me like they satisfied that criteria where you were talking about. So I just wonder, what leg does he have to stand on to make this kind of demand? Is he in a different role because he's not in the audience? Maybe I'm asking a question like that. Or in fact, is it incumbent upon him, in fact, if he wants that kind of principle followed, to follow it himself? I mean.
Yeah. So this is what I see as sort of the companion side to the question that I tried to answer through this talk, which is sort of thinking about the audience's responsibility, the audience's role in engaging humor. Right? So I think there's a companion side to that, which is the comedian's role in producing humor for an audience, right? And so yeah, that's what it was a bit ironic, right? Where if you look at that interview he did with Oprah, and sort of the sorts of things he communicated about being let down, not wanting to let down the Black community by producing humor that he encourages certain kinds of, stereotypical or derisive attitudes towards the Black community or whatever, but then didn't seem to quite take the same kind of care in his own sets or whatever. So part of what I say about the comedian's response is to do with the kinds of interpretations that they make available for the audience, right? That is, what they say occurs in a particular sort of social context. It's not unattached from the broader social context in which they live and move and how they're being, whatever. We live in contexts that are stratified along a number of different dimensions of the race, class, gender, ability, and so forth, right? And so I think for a comedian, they have to be careful about what sorts of hermeneutical resources they're producing or reinforcing, and whether or not those tools that they bring to bear on their comedy reinforces or strengthens the means of stratification, right? One thing you might say about Chappelle, at least in those moments with respect to his what many regarded as transphobic humor jokes, and that's sad, right? Was that he foreclosed interpretations from his audience that didn't allow them to undermine or subvert that particular sort of stratification.
I have a setup question for both of you all at the end, since this is the final session here. So get ready to solve the world's problems here. Discussing the role of art. That final question is coming before my ultimate very quick sum up. But something that Dr. Jones said struck me. You referenced George Floyd, and not being, so many people, just personally, we're at the end here, and I can just say, that's something that I would never forget, and I watched the whole 10 minutes, several times, and I think the effect that it'll have on me is going to be lasting. It's like the touch of your mother's hand, and after she's died. Like it's something that I can just feel quite often. Maybe not like feeling sort of him, but just the image, getting the image out of my mind is not going to be possible. But she said that the image of the kid, the person who had to cut his hair for the wrestling match, is the one that you can't get out of your mind. And I was wondering whether or not there was something perhaps aesthetic that's motivating sort of why that image is so lasting for you, why that's the image. So you kind of glazed over it. I'm sure it's represented well in your paper, but if you would say a little bit more about that, I'm just interested.
Let me see if I can. Let me say one more thing about the George Floyd image. The oral image, I will never get out of my head, of this man pleading, telling this man, and if he's asking for his dead mother, the oral image will never leave my head. The other image, I feel like, well, I can go back and look at Rodney. I have a hard time understanding why, when one looks at the beating of Rodney King, the killing of George Floyd somehow becomes more spectacular, more. If you are reading things like, and again, I'm really bad with names, but I've been, like when you read reports or you read writings of incarcerated Black people, people who were formerly incarcerated, and hear them talk, give their accounts of how they're treated by white people. And you've read these things over and over. Those are George Floyd images. If you've read about the Black man who was lynched and forced to cut off his penis and forced him to eat his testicles and his penis, why am I going to focus? How is the image of a white man like that, who I've seen in so many stories, and I've seen when I'm walking around, I'm afraid of him. How is that going to, it doesn't hold me in that way that George Floyd's voice does. But the picture, perhaps the picture of that boy, it holds me for a lot of reasons. One, I noticed Dr. Tori, and he might have just said it like that, he referred to the ref as cutting off the hair. I don't think it's aesthetic. I think it's a lot of things going on in the dynamics of that picture. Here with George Floyd, you've got all of these white people now afterwards ready to march and ready to do this and ready to do the other, and Black Lives Matter. You've got a gym where all of those white people could have said, well, fuck that, we all forfeit. We all forfeit. If he can't have his hair, you know, they're always claiming that, and so, you know, even when people are asking questions like, well, what can be done? What can be done? Here are small moments where what would it cost them? A wrestling match. To stand up, all of them together, yeah, white people, and say, no, we're not gonna wrestle them. If you have to cut his hair, then none of us is going to. Even his own teammates. And you've seen this in European football where Black footballers, Balotelli, all of them, thrown out of games because they will go and actually say something to white people throwing banana skins at them and calling them monkeys. They will get thrown out of the game. But do you see their teammates? Their white teammates. So it's the dynamics of that picture. The white girl, they're just cutting away. And you know, we love in philosophy to talk about a binary with white men and patriarchy on one side and women and people of color and Blacks on the other side. Here you see the white girl just fine in her role. You see a white boy imploring him. You see another white man just looking on. In the George Floyd image, when I watched the video, you see people coming as much as they could at those police officers. They were afraid and they were right to be. So it's the dynamic, the dynamics in that picture where you don't have the same kind of coercive force. You don't have the same kind, and yet people sat there and let that happen. They let it happen. And so when I say the image, it's not, I don't think of images as just the picture, okay? I think of image as a discourse behind the picture. If you think of state power and you think of police power and you think of all the ways those police were behaving, there's a way that, one, I know that story, I understand that fear. This story here, especially when white people are always talking about what can I do, what can we do, tell us what we can do, well, do something. So it's reasons like that, I would say, that lock that image, and I don't mean the picture, in my mind. Can I just say one thing more? If you hear, I've forgotten again the name, but the young Black boy who was killed in Colorado, and you hear what he's saying at the end. He's sitting, if you listen to the video, again, the oral, he's saying, he's trying to tell them he's not dangerous. I don't even eat meat. I like butterflies, whatever he was saying. And they're sitting there having a talk as he's dying, as though they are talking about, I don't know, the weather. This strikes me in a way that this white cop, and actually now I have more dialogue about what he was saying, saying things like, you ain't going, you know, something suggesting, telling Floyd, you're not going anywhere. I'm gonna do with you what I want. I know that dialogue. I know that I want to say in my stomach. But these people sitting around talking about the weather while a boy is dying and saying, I don't even hurt butterflies. The image, which includes the discourse for me, will not leave me.
We can just close it right there. First of all, join me in in thanking No, that was great. And thanking Dr. Anderson and Dr. Jones again silently, even though at this point we can just take our mics off and just go there. But I would like to close by again thanking the Humanities Center, thanking the Philosophy Department, thanking the Values Institute, again, highlighting certain people who've made this conference possible. I would really like to thank the speakers, some of which are not here, but thank you all for responding so well to my emails and things like that, for showing up and for giving like really great presentations. I would like to thank those who came out, not just to this session and who are here, but also who came out to the event over these 2 days. And I really want to encourage you to think about how you might take a lot of what has been said over the course of the last 2 days, and to think about where we might go and what we might do with them in order to promote racial unity or a progressive society. So hearkening back to what Dr. Wood said at the beginning of this day, and really some of what was implicit in the opening remarks of both Dr. Norton and myself. So think about sort of what we would do with this, and how we can use a lot of what we've done here to not just think out great ideas, but to make the world better, I guess, with our hands and minds, in a sense. All right. So with that, I'll close the conference unless Dr. Johnson has anything to say. Nope. Good. We'll close it out. Thanks for coming. Thanks for showing up. This has been great. This has been fun.